He stepped out in the middle of the day, hood up, gold frames catching the sun, pistol gripped tight like he had nothing to lose. People froze, others ducked, because nobody expected that kind of heat to rain down when kids were walking home and folks were running errands. Those shots ripped through the block and reminded everybody that some beefs never sleep, even under daylight. This wasn't random. This was somebody hunting rivals like prey in their own backyard. Before that liquor store corner, before the AutoZone lot, there was a man named Cleo Steele. Folks in South Los Angeles called him Tiny Fly. And this is his story. South Los Angeles in the mid-2000s carried scars from generations of gang wars, where every street corner had a story of blood spilled and families broken. The neighborhoods around Vermont Avenue and the 100-numbered streets were called Westmont and Vermont Vista, but people in the area gave it a darker name. They called it Death Alley. That stretch of Vermont Avenue between Manchester and Century had already seen over 60 homicides in just 7 years leading up to 2014, making it one of the deadliest strips in Los Angeles County. People who lived there walked the blocks like it was normal to hear gunfire, because in many ways it was. Mothers told their kids to duck when fireworks cracked because nobody wanted to mistake bullets for celebration, and young men grew up knowing that wearing the wrong color in the wrong block could cut a life short. For many residents, the daily fear of stray bullets was heavier than the fear of cops or robbers, because gunshots were not rare, they were expected. The Rollin 100s had claimed that area for decades, holding turf through sets that were all tied together under the Rollin unit's umbrella. One of those sets was the underground Crips, also known as the UG, who held down blocks around 105 Street and Normandy Avenue. The UG were infamous not just for holding their turf, but for the long rivalry they carried with the Hoovers, a beef that went back to the late 70s. That feud was one of the first Crip-on-Crip wars in Los Angeles, starting in January 1979, and it only grew more violent as the years went on. The Hoovers had once been Crips themselves, but by the mid-80s they broke away and built their own identity as the Hoover Criminals, sworn enemies of the Rollin 100s and many other sets under the neighborhood Crip banner. That split meant Hoover beef was deep and permanent, and by the time Tiny Fly was moving around in 2015, it was generational hate. The Hoovers were not standing alone either, because they had an alliance with the 8-Tray gangster Crips, better known as the 8 Trays, who sat just north of Westmont and carried the same kind of blood ties in war. In gang culture, sets are often split into cards, and those cards shape who stands together and who gets targeted. The Hoovers and 8 Trays sat on what people called the Gangster Crip card, sometimes shortened to the Tray card, while the Rollin 100s and other neighborhood sets stood on the Deuce card. That Tray versus Deuce divide was one of the deepest cuts in Los Angeles gang politics, and it played out in constant shootings, jump outs, and homicides across South LA. By the 2000s, these alliances and beefs had already produced decades of retaliation, and the streets were scarred with memories of family members lost in the cycle. Residents in Westmont knew the corner of 88th and Vermont as one of the flashpoints. That was Hoover and 8 Tray territory, but it sat right on the edge of Rollin 100 turf, making it a dangerous line where bodies had dropped more than once. By 2015, that intersection became a stage for what law enforcement would call some of the most brazen acts of daylight violence in recent Los Angeles memory. Rumors spread like wildfire in the summer of 2015 when social media lit up with the hashtag 100 Days, 100 Nights. According to Street Talk, the phrase meant gang members were pledging to commit 100 murders in 100 days after the death of a known figure named KP. KP was said to be a Broadway gangster Crip killed in Westmont in July 2015, though at first some people even confused his set and thought he was a Rollin 100. That confusion showed how wild the rumor mill was, with stories moving faster online than investigators could verify. Twitter and Instagram posts carried hashtags like 100 Days, number 100 Nights, and Pray for LA. And the whole city began to panic that a wave of murders was about to hit. Mothers told kids not to go outside, neighbors warned each other about stray bullets, and activists held vigils asking for peace. The Los Angeles Police Department treated those posts like serious threats, even though some believed it was mostly internet hype. Deputy Chief Bill Scott said the fear had taken on a life of its own because people thought it was turning into a Wild West situation where every corner carried a body. Extra patrols rode through South LA that summer, with cops stationed heavy around the Vermont corridor, hoping to cool down the violence. Community meetings were held where residents begged for help. but many also said they were tired of hearing promises while gunshots still cracked on their streets. Even though statistics showed there was not literally one killing every day, the spike in shootings that summer was undeniable. 9 murders and dozens of shootings were tied to the conflict, leaving the community shaken and the name 100 Days, 100 Nights etched into South LA lore. Through all this tension, one set was whispered about heavy in the streets: the underground Crips. Known as UG, their reputation stretched beyond their small turf because they had been at war with Hoovers and ate trays for over 40 years. For the UG, putting in work in enemy turf was a way of showing they still held weight. And in 2015, one member stood out as somebody who was willing to do just that. His name was Cleo Steele, but on the streets he was known as Tiny Fly. People in South LA said Tiny Fly was not a young hothead, but an older member in his 30s who had already been through the system and was not afraid of doing time. By the time these shootings started, law enforcement already had him documented as a UG member, and his own social media showed him throwing signs and flashing tattoos. Deputies who studied the gangs knew him by name, and they testified later that Tiny Fly had a reputation for putting in work. The stage was set by the summer of 2015. A long history of gang politics, decades of bloody rivalries, and the paranoia created by social media rumors all merged into an environment where one brazen shooter could spark terror across the city. Before his name filled police files and courtroom transcripts, Tiny Fly was just another man walking those blocks, but everyone around knew that war was always just one spark away in Death Alley. By the time the streets were boiling in 2015, one name was moving heavy through Westmont talk, and that was Cleo Steele, better known to everybody as Tiny Fly. He was not some random face in that mix. He was a documented member of the underground Crips holding ground around 105 Street and Normandy Avenue. That stretch had always been a stronghold for UG members, and Cleo grew up right in the middle of it. Cleo was born and raised in South Los Angeles, right in the heart of that UG territory, where kids learned early that gang presence shaped daily life. Neighbors remember the tension that surrounded those blocks, where every corner carried painted tags and memorial candles for somebody recently killed. Growing up in that kind of environment meant that gang culture was not some distant story, it was part of his daily routine. By his teenage years, Cleo had already brushed with the system, and his name eventually landed in law enforcement files as a known offender. He picked up felony convictions early in his life, and that status meant he was legally banned from owning any kind of firearm. Despite that, he stayed tied to the streets where guns were never far away, and that contradiction sat at the core of his reputation. The nickname Tiny Fly carried meaning beyond just a catchy alias, because gangs in Los Angeles often passed down names through different generations of members. You had big homies, lil homies, babies, tinies, and even infants, all tied to the same root name. Cleo picked up the name Tiny Fly, which signaled he came up under or after someone who already held the fly handle in the UG. That naming system gave identity to younger members while keeping ties to older figures inside the set. Names like Tiny, Baby, or Lil told the streets who you followed and what lineage you represented, and for Cleo, Tiny Fly became the title that stuck on him. That name circulated in the alleys, on the corners, and even in law enforcement gang files, where deputies knew him as part of the underground Crips network. His reputation began building long before 2015, because Cleo was not seen as a teenager running wild. He was a grown man moving inside gang politics. By the time he was in his 30s, he was already seen as someone willing to step up for violent missions. Law enforcement later testified that by then, he had already been feared enough that his name came up in investigations before the daylight shootings. Cleo's life was not limited to the feuds with Hoovers and 8 trays, because in September 2015, months after the shootings, he and another man named Johnny Johnson picked up a conviction for a home invasion robbery. That case had nothing to do with the murders, but it showed that he was still active in other violent crimes beyond gang rivalries. The home invasion conviction counted as a strike under California's 3 strikes law, and it later doubled some of his sentences once he was in court. That robbery showed that Cleo's violence was not situational, because even outside of the neighborhood wars, he carried himself like someone who was used to taking risks. Prosecutors later used that history to paint him as an opportunistic criminal who thrived on confrontation. Unlike younger gang members chasing quick recognition, Cleo was already older, in his mid-30s when the shootings went down, and that age gave him a different reputation. Many viewed him not as a reckless kid, but as an enforcer, somebody who had lived long enough to know consequences but was still ready to step into daylight missions. That balance of age and ruthlessness gave him clout inside the UG set and fear among rivals who crossed paths with him. Sheriff's Deputy Ernie Castaneda, a gang expert who studied the underground Crips, testified that Cleo was personally known to him and had been seen throwing up UG signs in photos and on Facebook. Castaneda explained that putting in work, meaning carrying out violent acts, was the way members earned respect, and Cleo embodied that. His willingness to move into enemy turf and fire shots in daylight was proof of someone who was trying to raise his status inside the gang world. In that culture, respect was currency, and acts like daytime shootings were considered high-level moves that cemented reputations. When somebody like Cleo hunted his rivals in full view of the community, he was not only aiming at individuals, but also sending a message across rival sets. It showed that the underground Crips could touch anybody at any time, and Cleo's name grew heavier because of that perception. By 2015, police considered him a key player inside UG activity, not just some background affiliate. His age, his past felonies, his home invasion conviction, and his visible presence in the neighborhood all gave weight to his profile. Cleo Steele was not just another man on the block, he was Tiny Fly, and his name was about to echo through South Los Angeles once the shootings tied him to brazen attacks in the rival turf. The legend of Tiny Fly came from a combination of his street upbringing, his willingness to pick up guns despite being barred, and the way his name tied into a bigger tradition of generational gang monikers. He was somebody who lived inside that cycle long enough to build recognition, and by the time bodies dropped in 2015, everyone in South Los Angeles knew the UG had a shooter whose name would not be forgotten. The beef between the underground Crips and the Hoovers stretched back to January 1979, when many people say one of the very first Crip-on-Crip wars erupted in South Los Angeles. That war made the Undergrounds and Hoovers permanent enemies, and 4 decades later the blood still spilled between those sets whenever the chance came. The Underground Crips, holding turf around 105 Street in Normandy, were locked into that cycle with the Hoovers, who controlled their own blocks just east along Vermont Avenue. That rivalry was long and bitter, and it helped shape the identity of both sides as the years piled on. The Hoovers had walked away from the Crip name by the mid-'80s, calling themselves the Hoover Criminals, and that only made the separation deeper. Their move turned the connection into a permanent split, and over time they became hated enemies of the Rollin 100's umbrella, which the Undergrounds belonged to. The Hoovers did not move alone either, because their alliance with the 8-Tray Gangster Crips gave them more muscle and created a partnership that stretched across blocks north and east of Rollin 100's territory. The 8-Trays, also known as the 8-Trays, were already enemies of neighborhood sets, so they stood right alongside the Hoovers in many shootouts. In gang politics, people talked about the Deuce card and the Tray card, which was like two opposing camps. The Rollin 100s and other neighborhood sets like the Rollin 60s sat on the Deuce side, while Hoovers and 8-Trays represented the Tray side. That division created a natural line of conflict, and South Los Angeles became the battlefield for it. By the time 2015 rolled around, the war between the Undergrounds and the Hoover Alliance had already produced too many funerals. Old beef never faded, it only simmered until somebody pulled the trigger again. That was the atmosphere when the rumors of a challenge called 100 Days, 100 Nights started spinning through Los Angeles streets. In July 2015, a man named Kenneth Peavy, better known as KP, was killed in Westmont, and his death became the spark for wild talk on the streets. Some people said KP was part of the Broadway Gangster Crips, while others even confused his set and called him a Rollin 100, showing how messy the information spread. What really caught fire was not the facts, but the hashtags, because social media carried the idea that gangs pledged to commit 100 murders in 100 days to get revenge for KP. The phrase 100 days, 100 nights showed up on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, and people across the city began believing it was a death count waiting to happen. Deputy Chief Bill Scott of LAPD later said the fear grew faster than the violence itself, because families really believed Los Angeles was turning into a battlefield where bodies dropped on every block. Parents pulled kids off porches, schools warned families to stay safe, and pastors spoke at pulpits about keeping faith through chaos. The police sent extra patrols into South Los Angeles, holding community meetings and trying to calm everybody down, but the paranoia had already gripped people. While statistics showed there was not literally one murder every single day, the violence that summer was heavy enough to make the rumor believable. Westmont carried the worst of that fear because the Vermont corridor had already earned the nickname Death Alley, and everybody who lived there felt like they were sitting in the middle of a war zone. Residents talked about stray bullets hitting walls, kids being pulled away from front porches, and grown men refusing to hang outside after dark. One longtime resident said the shootings were pretty much an everyday thing, and admitted that he stopped even sitting on his porch because he feared stray bullets could come at any time. Another neighbor described walking home with their eyes on every corner because trust was gone and safety was no guarantee. In the summer of 2015, every conversation in Westmont circled back to Hoovers and Undergrounds because everybody knew that beef was burning hottest at the time. Folks said it was not just another rumor, it was years of tension that had finally reached the boiling point, and all eyes were on the Hoover and UG conflict to see where the next body would fall. On March 12, 2015, Cleveland Ross IV spent the afternoon with his father at the AutoZone near Century Boulevard and Hoover Street in South Los Angeles. His BMW had been giving him trouble, and like many young men who took pride in their rides, he decided to fix the problem with his father's help. It was around 4:45 in the afternoon, broad daylight, traffic moving, customers coming in and out of the store, and life felt normal in that lot. Cleveland's father, Cleveland Ross III, stepped into the store to pick up a part, leaving his son outside in the parking lot with the car hood popped. Cleveland leaned over the engine, tools in his hands, never expecting that enemies were already circling. As Cleveland worked, a burgundy Buick rolled into the lot and came to a slow stop just a few feet from his BMW. The door opened and a man stepped out. Witnesses remembered him clearly: bald head, medium build, wearing distinctive gold-framed glasses. In his hand, he carried a .357 revolver, described by onlookers as a Clint Eastwood-style gun. Without hesitation, the shooter raised the revolver and fired multiple times into Cleveland's direction. Loud cracks echoed across the parking lot as bullets ripped through the air. Cleveland was struck several times, his body folding beside the BMW as the shooter calmly turned and slid back into the waiting Buick. Within seconds, the car pulled out of the lot and vanished into traffic. Inside the AutoZone, Cleveland's father heard the sharp sound of gunfire. He rushed outside, heart pounding, and saw his son lying on the ground bleeding heavily. Cleveland III dropped beside him, cradling his son's body in the parking lot, screaming for help as customers scrambled in shock. The image of a father holding his dying son in daylight is something that never left witnesses who saw it. Several people inside the store had heard the shots, and some caught glimpses of the shooter as he pulled the trigger. One customer, a man named Derek Jones, told police he saw a bald, brown-skinned man with glasses pointing the gun. Another witness, Michael Marlette, and his wife Daniela also gave descriptions, saying the shooter looked like he was in his 40s and carried a big revolver that resembled a cowboy movie gun. They noticed his glasses too, round-framed and unforgettable in the chaos. Nearby businesses also provided footage, and detectives recovered surveillance video from a car wash close to the AutoZone. The tape showed a red or burgundy car pulling into the lot and a man stepping out to open fire. The problem was the grainy quality of the video, which made it impossible to get a clear view of the shooter's face or the license plate. Investigators were left with partial details, but nothing solid enough to make an immediate arrest. Paramedics arrived quickly, rushing Cleveland to the hospital as his father prayed outside the ambulance. But the damage was too severe, and doctors pronounced Cleveland Ross IV dead not long after. He was only 27 years old, and his death left his family shattered. His fiancée was pregnant with their first child, a little girl, who would be born just months later without ever meeting her father. Cleveland's family spoke publicly about his life, describing him as a man who loved sports and cared about his future child. His mother, Latrice, said he was excited about becoming a father and had been looking forward to calling himself Daddy. For her, the heartbreak was not just losing her son, but knowing that his daughter would never know him in person. While his family insisted Cleveland was not gang involved, the streets told a different story. On blocks across South Los Angeles, Cleveland was known by the nicknames Boo Boo and Red Bang. Among Hoover members, he was also called Infant Red, suggesting he was a younger homie tied to someone older who carried the red handle. Hoover members often took names that used red, despite the traditional Crip Blue identity, and Cleveland's nickname tied him directly to that Hoover lineage. To law enforcement, Cleveland's presence in the AutoZone lot in the middle of Hoover territory raised alarms immediately. That block was deep inside 107 Hoover turf, and everybody in the neighborhood knew Hoovers used that intersection regularly. To detectives, it looked like a targeted hit carried out by rivals who spotted him and decided to strike while he was exposed. The Criminal Gang Homicide Division of the LAPD responded quickly, taking over the case from the start. Their focus landed on the underground Crips because the hit had all the markings of a UG mission. They noted the shooter came boldly in the middle of the day, pulled up in a car with backup, and opened fire without fear of witnesses. That type of strike fit the underground Crips' reputation for aggressive daylight missions into rival territory. Detectives interviewed every witness they could find, but the shooter's description remained frustratingly vague. Bald, around his 30s or 40s, wearing gold-framed glasses. The car was a Buick, possibly burgundy or red. The weapon was a .357 revolver. No one had caught the license plate, and the video footage was too blurry to provide a clear ID. For months, the case went cold, sitting without charges while detectives tried to connect the dots. On the streets, though, people talked, and rival gangs pointed fingers toward the underground Crips. To them, the AutoZone murder was not just a killing, it was a statement. Enemies believed the UG wanted to show they could cross lines into Hoover turf and take lives without fear. The symbolism of shooting a Hoover affiliate in his own backyard while his father was inside the store carried heavy weight in gang culture. The message was clear: nowhere was safe, not even a crowded AutoZone lot under the afternoon sun. To residents of Westmont and Vermont Vista, the murder brought back that uneasy feeling that gang wars were no longer confined to alleys or nighttime drive-bys. Here was a man gunned down in broad daylight while running errands with his father, and that shook people deeply. Community members began speaking on how normal it had become to see violence spill out onto streets where families shopped and children played. For many, Cleveland's murder became another reminder that South Los Angeles was still trapped in a cycle of revenge where even a quick stop for car parts could turn into a death scene. The case of Cleveland Boo Boo Ross became one of the early sparks that summer, raising tension on both sides. Hoovers mourned one of their own, with people on forums posting tributes like R.I.P. Infant Red, while the underground Crips quietly celebrated the boldness of the mission. Detectives did not yet have the evidence to put a name to the shooter, but the streets whispered the description clearly. When that Buick pulled away from the AutoZone, it carried more than just a killer. It carried the weight of an old feud reigniting. The daylight murder showed that somebody was hunting rivals openly, sending a message that 2015 would not pass without more bodies hitting the ground. The story of Cleveland Ross's final moments connected the past with the present, tying old rivalries from the late 70s to the current climate of Westmont. For law enforcement, it was a puzzle waiting for evidence. For his family, it was heartbreak that nothing could fix. For the streets, it was confirmation that the UG were moving aggressively into Hoover territory again. That AutoZone lot became the scene that started it all, the beginning of a chain of events that would unravel through summer and drag Cleo, Tiny Fly Steele, into the spotlight as the man suspected of turning Westmont into a hunting ground. By June 2015, the 100 Days, 100 Nights talk was spinning across Los Angeles, and fear hung heavy in Westmont. The murder of Cleveland Ross in March had already raised the stakes, and rival sets were waiting for the next move. That move came on June 10th, 2015, outside Monarch Liquor Store, when a liquor run turned into a deadly ambush that shocked even seasoned residents of South Los Angeles. It was early afternoon, around 12:30, and four young men pulled up to the corner of 88th Street and Vermont Avenue in a gray Dodge Dart. Behind the wheel was Michael Baptist, and riding with him were Kevin Carr, a Hoover affiliate, Laurel Williams, and Michael Washington, better known in the streets as G. Whitted, a member of the 8 Trey Gangster Crips. For them, it was supposed to be a quick stop, just a run into Monarch Liquor for some cigarettes and drinks, nothing more. The block was busy that day, with people out on the sidewalks and cars passing regularly. On the corner nearby, a 37-year-old woman named Lisa Jack stood reading a book, completely unaware that she would soon become part of the chaos. For her, it was a normal Wednesday, the kind of day when nobody expects gunfire to erupt in broad daylight. Michael parked the Dodge on 88th Street beside the store, stepped inside to buy cigarettes, and left his friends outside. Kevin Carr stayed near the car. Laurel waited in the back seat, and Michael walked across Vermont Avenue, apparently to greet somebody he recognized on the other side of the street. To anyone watching, nothing looked out of place. That calm shifted quickly when a brown Saturn sedan cruised slowly down 88th Street, catching the attention of Michael as he stepped out of the store. He did not recognize anyone in the car, and his instincts told him something was wrong. In gang territory, an unfamiliar car creeping past was often a warning sign. Before Michael could return, another car appeared, a white Chevy Malibu, pulling up directly behind the parked Dodge. The Malibu's position left Michael's car boxed in from the rear, with the Saturn now pulling across the front. It was a setup designed to trap the Dodge with no escape. Within seconds, the ambush turned deadly. From the Saturn, a man jumped out wearing a hoodie and those same distinctive gold-framed glasses witnesses had described 3 months earlier at the AutoZone shooting. In his hands, he held a 9mm handgun with an extended magazine, capable of spraying more than 20 rounds without pause. Witnesses remembered how quickly he raised the gun and opened fire, unleashing a stream of bullets into the Dodge and toward anyone standing near it. The air filled with rapid gunfire, neighbors later describing it as 6 shots at once, then 6 more, then another burst. A relentless barrage that shook the entire block. The bullets punched through metal, glass, and flesh, tearing into the Dodge and striking the people trapped inside and around it. Michael, still by the driver's side, felt the bullet slam into his body. One went through his leg, another struck his back, and another tore into his cheek. He would later realize he had been hit 5 times, yet somehow he stayed alive, blood pouring but consciousness intact. His Dodge was shredded by gunfire, even the gear shift destroyed by a bullet, making it impossible to drive out. Kevin Carr tried to run, bolting from the Dodge as bullets chased him across the pavement. He managed a short distance before one round struck his leg, dropping him to the ground. Crawling to safety, he recalled hearing the shooter's chilling words, "You next," before another bullet crashed into Michael's face. For Kevin, survival meant playing dead as shots whistled past his body. Laurel Williams stayed ducked in the car, glass raining on him as the Dodge filled with holes. His survival depended on staying low as bullets sprayed the vehicle. He escaped with his life but carried the memory of watching friends struck down inches away. Across the street, Michael tried to sprint when the first shots rang out, but the gunman's focus was clear. Multiple rounds hit him as he stumbled away, collapsing about a block north on 91st Place. At only 24 years old, Michael G. Whitted Washington died in the middle of the sidewalk, blood pooling beneath him before paramedics could even arrive. Nearby, Lisa Jack suddenly realized she had been shot as well. A stray round struck her hip, sending her collapsing in shock. She was not gang affiliated, just a woman reading her book on a South Los Angeles sidewalk caught in the line of fire. When the gunman finished, he bolted back into the Saturn, which sped away in tandem with the Malibu. Witnesses on an MTA bus sitting at the intersection said they saw a bald man in gold-framed glasses jump into the passenger seat before the cars peeled off. The ambush was over and silence returned, broken only by the sound of sirens approaching from blocks away. The aftermath left shattered glass across the sidewalk, spent shell casings scattered in the street, and blood marking the spots where victims had fallen. Neighbors rushed out to help, but the scene was chaos. Michael lay bleeding inside the Dodge. Kevin crawled in pain from his leg wound, and Laurel sat shaken but alive. Lisa Jack clutched her hip while neighbors called 911, and Mikhail's lifeless body remained on 91st Place. Paramedics worked frantically, transporting Michael, Kevin, Laurel, and Lisa to hospitals. Michael's injuries were severe, but he survived 5 gunshot wounds. Kevin's leg wound required surgery, and Lisa recovered from her hip injury. Laurel walked away with his life intact. Only Mikhail Washington did not survive, his body declared dead at 12:44 p.m. News crews rushed to the block, reporting live as the liquor store was taped off, with dozens of bullet markers scattered across the asphalt. ABC 7's Jory Rand reported heartbreak in South Los Angeles after gunshots rang out in broad daylight, describing how shocking it was to see an ambush at a busy intersection. The Los Angeles Times carried headlines about 1 dead and several injured, noting that detectives immediately suspected the shooting was tied to gang warfare. For investigators, the details of the ambush carried clear signs of planning. The boxed-in Dodge, the extended magazine, the quick escape, all suggested this was a coordinated mission. To residents, it was another reminder that South Los Angeles had not escaped the cycle of violence. This was Vermont Avenue, broad daylight, middle of the week, and still bodies lay in the street. The symbolism hit harder because of the location. That corner at 88th in Vermont was known as Hoover and 8 Tray territory, the rival stronghold directly across from Rollin 100 Turf. For underground Crips to send a shooter into that heartland in broad daylight was a deliberate show of force. It was not about hiding in alleys or creeping at night. It was about telling rivals they could be hunted anywhere, anytime, even while standing outside a liquor store. Community voices spoke out, but many admitted that violence had become normalized. Interventionist Kevin Twin Orange, a former Hoover affiliate, stood at the scene and said, "It doesn't matter if it's gang-related or not, it's a loss of life." He had lost his own brother and cousin to gang violence, and his presence showed the cycle continued. Another resident, Cheryl Newsom, told reporters that shootings in the area had become everyday events, saying, "To me, it's normal." Still, the murder of Michael Washington hit particularly hard. Friends described him as a father who had recently welcomed a baby, trying to find a better path. His life ended just as he looked for change, leaving behind another child growing up without a father in South Los Angeles. For law enforcement, this massacre drew connections back to the March AutoZone shooting. Both involved a bald shooter with gold-framed glasses, both carried out in broad daylight, and both inside rival territory. Investigators already suspected the underground Crips, and now the similarities between the two events pushed detectives closer to identifying a single man. The liquor store shooting proved one thing clearly to everyone in South Los Angeles. Whoever this shooter was, he was not afraid of consequences, police, or public witnesses. He was hunting rivals with a style that shocked even a community used to gunfire. After the liquor store massacre on June 10, 2015, detectives from both LAPD and the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department knew they were staring at a potential spiral of endless revenge. The AutoZone murder from March had already rattled nerves, but the Monarch Liquor ambush proved that the shooter was escalating. Law enforcement feared that if nobody was caught soon, South Los Angeles would drown in more retaliations. Inside gang units, rumors spread fast, and talk on the streets matched whispers in police briefings. Everyone kept saying the same thing: the AutoZone hit, and the liquor store massacre looked like the work of the same man. The bald shooter, the gold frames, the broad daylight confidence all matched perfectly. Detectives worried they were dealing with a serial gang assassin who thrived on hunting rivals in enemy turf. Witnesses had given consistent descriptions in both incidents, describing a bald African-American man in his 30s, wearing gold-rimmed glasses. Those details, combined with the brazen style of the shootings, pointed investigators toward a name already on their radar. That name was Cleo Steele, better known as Tiny Fly, a 34-year-old documented underground Crip with priors. Detectives pulled Steele's photo and matched it to what witnesses had described. The physical traits lined up cleanly: bald, medium build, signature glasses. With that, they began testing his face in lineups. In July, Kevin Carr, still recovering from the leg wound he caught outside Monarch Liquor, picked Steele out of a six-pack photo lineup. Kevin initially told detectives that Steele was the man he saw with the gun that day. Although Kevin would later grow quiet and try to backtrack, his first identification gave detectives strong confidence. Another witness stepped forward with equal importance. A Metro bus driver who had been stopped at the intersection of 88th and Vermont during the liquor store shooting gave testimony. He remembered the chaos, the sound of rapid gunfire, and crucially, he saw a man in gold-rimmed glasses diving into the brown Saturn before it sped away. When shown the photo lineup, the bus driver also identified Steele as the shooter. That second confirmation tightened the circle around Tiny Fly. Meanwhile, word on the street had already crowned Steele as the man behind both killings. Hoovers were convinced the AutoZone hit was his doing, since the victim, Cleveland Boo Boo Ross, was one of their own. 8 Trays believed Steele killed their homie, Michael G. Whitted, Washington, at Monarch Liquor. For them, it was not about detectives or evidence, it was about revenge, and everyone in that neighborhood knew who they thought was guilty. The way people described it, the name Tiny Fly carried through barbershops, liquor stores, and porches. Folks repeated, "Same dude did both hits," and pointed at underground Crips as the crew that organized the missions. Even UG members themselves were whispering his name, some out of pride for his boldness, others out of fear that law enforcement pressure would soon collapse onto them. Inside police stations, detectives laid out a strategy. They wanted to build the case slowly, piece by piece, not only against Steele but also against his accomplices. They knew daylight ambushes like these were rarely solo acts. Getaway drivers, backup cars, and spotters always circled around the main shooter, and the AutoZone attack and the Monarch massacre showed signs of organized gang methods. The box-in strategy at Monarch Liquor proved coordination. 1 car in front, 1 car in back, shooter in between. Detectives called it a deliberate formation, meant to trap the victims and guarantee kills. The AutoZone hit had looked similar, with multiple cars moving into place before the shots fired. To law enforcement, this pattern screamed underground Crip planning, a crew moving with tactical street knowledge. With Steele already suspected as the triggerman, detectives shifted to his circle. they started targeting names connected to the undergrounds, especially men known to own or use the getaway vehicles described by witnesses. They ran down license plates, checked DMV records, and cross-referenced cell tower pings from phones tied to UG members. One by one, they began identifying possible accomplices. The Malibu that boxed in Michael Baptist's Dodge Dart drew particular interest. Detectives traced it to a UG affiliate named Patrick Bell, and surveillance footage even caught the plate number near the liquor store scene. Bell's presence tied the undergrounds directly to the shooting, and detectives leaned hard on him later. The brown Saturn, the car carrying the shooter, also became a focus. Neighbors told investigators it belonged to a UG member named Edward Furge. That lead connected Steele to a vehicle witnesses swore carried the man in gold frames. Detectives seized the car and later pulled DNA from inside, tying multiple UG members to the ride. Meanwhile, detectives worked on cell tower records for Steele himself. On March 12th, the day of the AutoZone murder, his phone pinged towers near 105 in Normandy before the shooting, then near Century and Hoover at the time of the murder, and back at 105 shortly afterward. The pattern matched exactly what witnesses described about the three-car convoy. That digital trail made detectives more confident Steele was their shooter. Law enforcement pressure mounted, and investigators started bringing UG members in one by one. The strategy was clear: break down the circle until somebody flipped. Detectives knew from experience that once heavy charges landed, somebody always talked. The goal was to use accomplices to build the bigger case against Tiny Fly, making it airtight when it finally hit court. By late 2015, detectives had enough leads to show prosecutors that both killings were linked to Steele. Witness IDs, cell records, street whispers, and car evidence all stacked together. Even before anyone testified, the case pointed at one man, a bald UG member in gold frames known as Tiny Fly. For South Los Angeles, the manhunt meant more than just paperwork and lineups. It was a race against time. Every day that Steele walked free meant the possibility of another daylight body. Law enforcement was desperate to stop him before another ambush erupted, because the community was already stretched thin by fear. The murders of Cleveland Ross and Michael Washington symbolized decades of hate between underground Crips, Hoovers, and 8 Treys, but detectives now believed one man was carrying that feud into daylight with reckless confidence. Identifying him was only the first step. Now they had to break his circle and prove the case in a courtroom strong enough to hold. The murders at the AutoZone and Monarch Liquor left detectives with fear and suspicion, but they still needed airtight proof. Street whispers pointed to Tiny Fly, but whispers could not carry a case into court. To lock it down, detectives leaned on the oldest tactic in gang investigations, pressuring insiders until somebody cracked. That break came when underground Crip members themselves started talking, giving detectives the inside play-by-play of both hits. One of the first names to fold was Quincy Jefferson, a younger underground known for hanging around 105 Street near Normandy. That block was a UG stronghold where crews gathered daily, and Quincy said he was there on March 12, 2015, the day Cleveland Ross was killed at the AutoZone. According to Quincy, several members sat outside when 2 others pulled up with information. Their names were Infant Toon and Baby Hound, both UG affiliates who had just spotted Cleveland Boo Boo Ross in Hoover territory. They told the group they saw Ross working on a car near AutoZone with his father inside the store. The energy shifted immediately, and Quincy said Tiny Fly was the one who took charge. Somebody asked, "What we doing?" And Cleo responded with the decision that set the hit in motion. "Let's go over there." From there, cars got chosen, and the convoy prepared to roll. Quincy explained the tactic known as the 3-car method, which was common in Los Angeles gangland. The shooter rode in the middle car, while one vehicle went ahead as a lookout, and another stayed behind for protection. That way, if cops or rivals tried following, the front and rear cars provided cover while the shooter carried out the mission. For the AutoZone hit, Quincy said he drove a silver Chrysler 300, while another member named Johnny rolled in a BMW, and Tiny Fly rode with Demetrius in the burgundy Buick. They pulled towards Century and Hoover, scoping the lot where Cleveland worked on his BMW. Quincy said he circled a few times before the other cars moved in. Once the Buick rolled up, Cleo leaned across the roof, aimed the .357 revolver, and fired multiple rounds into Ross. After the shots, the convoy peeled off, each car splitting different ways back toward 105 Street. Cell phone tower records later matched Quincy's story perfectly. Data placed his phone on 105th around 4:20 p.m., then pinging near Century Boulevard during the shooting window at 4:40 p.m., before returning to 105th by 5:15 p.m. Those records showed movement consistent with the convoy Quincy described. His testimony and the digital trail gave detectives the strongest evidence yet that Steele pulled the trigger at AutoZone. Months later, after the Monarch Liquor Massacre, another UG member became the weak link. Patrick Bell, a cousin of Steele by marriage, was tied to the white Chevy Malibu that boxed in the Dodge Dart during the ambush. At first, Patrick denied everything, telling investigators he knew nothing about the shooting. Detectives pressed harder, pointing out evidence and reminding him that gang murder charges could bury him for life. Under pressure, Patrick eventually flipped, choosing to cooperate in exchange for leniency. Patrick admitted that on June 10, 2015, he was in the area visiting his grandmother near 88th Street. He recognized two cars belonging to UG members, a brown Saturn and a Chevy Monte Carlo. Somebody gestured for him to follow, and he made a U-turn to fall in line. He said they caravanned into rival turf, heading toward 88th in Vermont, where Hoover and 8 Trey members were known to hang out. According to Patrick, once they stopped, he saw Cleo step out of the brown Saturn wearing a hoodie and those signature gold frames. In his hands was a handgun with an extended magazine. Without hesitation, Cleo raised it and opened fire on the Dodge Dart and everybody near it. Patrick admitted he pulled up in his Malibu and ended up blocking the Dodge from reversing, though he tried to claim it was unplanned. Patrick described watching Steele unload more than 20 rounds, bullets flying across the intersection, tearing into Michael Baptist, Kevin Carr, Laurel Williams, and killing Mikael Washington. Patrick admitted he was shaken by the chaos, but he fled the scene along with the others. Later, detectives told him flatly that he was already identified as the Malibu driver, and unless he cooperated, he would face murder charges carrying life sentences. To sweeten the deal, prosecutors offered Patrick relocation and financial assistance, totaling around $17,000, so he could move his family and avoid retaliation. That incentive sealed his cooperation, and Patrick gave the courtroom testimony that tied Steele directly to the liquor store ambush. Detectives also backed Patrick's account with physical evidence. They recovered the brown Saturn and pulled DNA samples from inside. Results tied multiple UG members to the vehicle, including Marcus Furge, Edward Furge, and a member nicknamed White Shane. Their DNA sat on items like water bottles and soda cans inside the car, proving they had been part of the convoy. The evidence stacked quickly. Quincy's testimony for the AutoZone murder, Patrick's testimony for the liquor store massacre, and DNA linking additional UG members to the shooter's vehicle. Together, these pieces boxed Steele in legally, surrounding him with insider accounts and scientific proof. By the time the case reached prosecutors, Steele was no longer just a suspect. He was the man named by his own crew. The shooter in gold frames identified by multiple witnesses. The convicting link between two of the most brazen daylight murders in South Los Angeles during 2015. The flips from Quincy and Patrick ensured that when Tiny Fly stepped into court, he would not stand as a lone gangster. He would stand as a man betrayed by his circle and cornered by evidence too strong to deny. By the time Cleo Tiny Fly Steele stepped into court, prosecutors stacked a mountain of charges on him. He faced 2 counts of murder for Cleveland Ross and Michael Washington, along with 4 counts of attempted murder for Michael Baptist, Kevin Carr, Laurel Williams, and Lisa Jack. On top of that, the state added weapons charges and gang enhancements that could push sentences even higher. The prosecution built its case layer by layer, beginning with the testimony of Quincy Jefferson, who tied Steele directly to the AutoZone killing. Quincy told jurors how Tiny Fly stepped out of the Buick, leaned over the roof, and fired his revolver at Cleveland Ross. He described the convoy of cars, the setup, and the escape, making Steele the triggerman. They followed Quincy with Derek Jones, the AutoZone customer who saw a bald man with gold frames pulling the trigger that afternoon. Derek's testimony gave a direct eyewitness confirmation, matching what Quincy already described. It painted Steele as the shooter standing just feet away from Cleveland Ross. Next came the cell phone data, which placed Steele's device on 105th Street before the AutoZone hit, then near Century Boulevard during the time of the shooting, and back on 105th afterward. The data backed up Quincy's story completely, showing a timeline that matched the convoy's movements. The prosecution then turned to Patrick Bell, whose testimony explained the Monarch Liquor ambush. Patrick described Steele stepping out of the brown Saturn, wearing a hoodie and gold glasses, and unloading a 9mm with an extended magazine into the Dodge Dart. He admitted driving the Malibu that boxed in the victims, making himself part of the setup. His testimony placed Steele at the center of the Daylight Massacre. They added Kevin Carr's earlier identification from the photo lineup. Kevin had been shot in the leg during the liquor store ambush, and while he later grew quiet in court, his initial idea of Steele as the shooter carried weight for jurors. To tie everything together, the state called Sheriff's Deputy Ernie Castaneda as their gang expert. Castaneda explained the background of the underground Crips, their war with the Hoovers and 8 Trays, and the importance of putting in work to raise status. He walked the jury through Steele's Facebook posts, which showed gang signs, UG tattoos, and images captioned with references to HK, meaning Hoover Killer. Castaneda told jurors this was not random violence, but gang business meant to boost the reputation of Steele and his set. The defense tried to break holes in the case, attacking credibility at every turn. They argued Quincy Jefferson was not trustworthy because he had originally faced murder charges himself before flipping for a lighter sentence. They said his deal with prosecutors made his testimony nothing more than a trade for freedom. They also attacked Patrick Bell, pointing out how he lied to detectives multiple times before flipping under pressure and accepting money and relocation benefits. To push back, the defense called Johnny Johnson, a UG member who testified that Steele was not the shooter. Johnny claimed he was driving the BMW at AutoZone and saw someone else pulling the trigger, not Cleo. He admitted he lied to investigators earlier, but insisted in court that Steele was not the man with the gun. The defense highlighted inconsistencies in eyewitness accounts too. Some said the shooter was older, others described different frames on his glasses, and the surveillance footage remained too blurry to give clear proof. They pressed jurors to doubt the reliability of people who testified under fear or after making deals. The courtroom carried heavy tension through the trial. Many witnesses admitted fear of retaliation, and prosecutors reminded jurors about the no-snitch culture that kept people from speaking up. Even those who testified against Steele knew the risks of being labeled a snitch inside South Los Angeles. Despite the defense effort, the weight of the evidence stacked too high. Jurors heard consistent stories from multiple sources, saw the cell tower data, and listened to the gang expert explain the context of the crimes. The layers built a picture that Steele had been the shooter in both daylight missions. After weeks of testimony, the jury returned its verdict. Cleo Tiny Fly. Steele was found guilty on nearly every count, including both murders, 4 attempted murders, and the weapons charges. The only count where he was not convicted was conspiracy, but everything else stuck firmly. At sentencing, the judge handed down 2 life sentences without the possibility of parole for the murders of Cleveland Ross and Michael Washington. On top of that, Steele received over 90 years to life for the attempted murders, weapons enhancements, and gang enhancements. The judge ordered all sentences to run consecutively, ensuring that Steele would never walk free again. The sentence effectively buried Steele alive inside California's prison system. With no parole and multiple life terms, he would spend the rest of his days behind walls. Prosecutors told the courtroom that the punishment fit the crimes, because Steele had shown no fear hunting rivals in daylight and left families shattered across South Los Angeles. For the families of Cleveland Ross and Michael Washington, the verdict brought a measure of closure, though the loss remained permanent. For detectives, the conviction showed that flipping insiders like Quincy and Patrick could still bring justice, even inside neighborhoods where silence often ruled. For the streets, the message was clear. Tiny Fly had hunted rivals with confidence, but in the end, the system hunted him down and locked him away forever. After Steele's conviction, law enforcement doubled down on the 100 days, 100 nights violence that had spread fear across Los Angeles. Task forces targeted hotspots in Westmont and Vermont Vista, rounding up suspected shooters and pressing charges on dozens of underground Crips, Hoovers, and 8 Trays. Reports later showed that by the end of 2015, nearly 38 people were arrested under operations connected to the crackdown. Authorities claimed the extra presence cooled the cycle of retaliations, though murders in South Los Angeles never truly stopped. Even after Steele was sentenced, violence kept showing its face. In 2018, Monarch Liquor became the scene of another shooting, a grim reminder that turf wars never died. Locals said the corner carried a curse, with blood spilled there too many times to count. For the community, Steele's imprisonment did not erase the trauma of daylight ambushes or the fear of new shooters stepping into his role. Families carried the heaviest weight. Cleveland Ross left behind a daughter born just months after his death. She grew up without ever meeting her father, raised with only stories and photographs. For his parents and fiancée, every milestone reminded them of the life he lost fixing his BMW that afternoon. Michael Washington's family lived a parallel pain. At only 24 years old, he also left behind a child. Friends said he wanted to provide stability and had spoken about turning his life around. Instead, his child grew up in South Los Angeles without him. Another life shaped by the cycle of fatherless households linked to gang warfare. For people inside the streets, Tiny Fly became a cautionary tale. His boldness earned fear and respect for a moment, but his actions brought life sentences that erased any future. Residents described it as a reminder that hunting rivals in daylight carried no true reward. Some summed it up by saying he hunted his ops in daylight but ended up hunted by justice. Appeals came, but they changed little. In 2023, Steele's legal team challenged parts of his case, focusing on the gang enhancements that added extra decades. The California Court of Appeal upheld his murder convictions without hesitation. Judges agreed there was overwhelming evidence he pulled the trigger in both daylight ambushes. The retrial they granted covered only gang enhancements, but it did not alter the overall sentence. Steele remained buried in prison with 2 life terms without parole and more than 90 years stacked on top. For South Los Angeles, the aftermath of Steele's story showed the same cycle repeating. Young men gunned down, children growing up without fathers, and the justice system burying shooters for life. The case closed a chapter on Tiny Fly, but the violence in Death Alley never fully closed with it.